Hey guys, welcome back. In this video we're making a macrame style crystal keyring. The crystal sits inside the netting and then we slide this bead up to pull the straps apart and swap our crystal out. So you can easily swap crystals in and out that are a similar size and shape, and then bring that bead back down again to lock it in place. Now you want to choose a couple of crystals that are similar sizes. See, mine here are about 1 inch by 1 or 2 inches long. They are generally about the same volume. That macrame net will take a little bit of variation, but only maybe 1 or 2 centimeters bigger or smaller. For our design today, we're using 0.8 millimeter polyester thread, and then we've got a bead here with a nice big hole. So we need to fit all our threads up inside. So it does need that big hole in the center. And we've got a metal keyring or carabiner. For our design today, we need 4 30-inch lengths of our 0.8 millimeter polyester thread. So we just measure out all 4 lengths and cut them to size. Now we place all the ends of each thread together. Then placing these ends with the other ends, and then following it back down to the middle. Now we want to place a simple overhand knot in the center here. So bringing those threads around to form a loop, and then bringing all the threads through the loop, pulling it down nice and tight. Making sure each thread is pulled tight on both sides of the knot. Now I find it easiest if I turn the cords so they're up and down and I can work on the right hand side. I'm right-handed, so that's easiest. Now we start holding this center knot and bringing one thread out of the top and one out of the bottom, and tying a simple overhand knot in these cords. So bringing the cords around to form a loop, bringing the ends through the loop, and pulling that knot down tight onto about 1 centimeter away from that center knot. So grabbing a ruler and just checking. If you're happy with it, then you can pull it down nice and tight. Now we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So pulling out 2 cords that sit next to each other from each side of that center knot, and tying a simple overhand knot on this side as well. Pulling that knot down nice and tight, about 1 centimeter away from that center knot, so it sits nice and evenly with the knot on the opposite side. Now each layer of our net has 4 knots, so we just go ahead and pop another simple overhand knot on these 2 sides as well, pulling them down about 1 centimeter away from that center knot so they're all sitting nice and even. Now you should have something that looks like this, with a cross shape, and there's a small knot on each of the 4 sides. Now we bring 2 cords that sit next to each other, so 1 out of each knot there, and holding pressure onto that center knot, we just bring these cords together and place a simple overhand knot. Pulling that down nice and tight, about 1 centimeter away from the previous knots. Now we're going to work our way around so that we've got 4 knots on this layer as well. So pulling 2 cords that sit next to each other, 1 out of each knot, and tying an overhand knot on there, pulling it down to that 1 centimeter mark. So working our way around until we've got 4 knots on this layer as well. Pulling 2 cords together that sit next to each other and holding that pressure on the center knot. Tying an overhand knot and pulling it down so it's even with the other knots. It can seem a little messy with cords kind of going everywhere, but just take your time and you should be able to see which cords you need to tie together. Now your net should be starting to form. You should have something that looks like this, and your crystal is going to sit in the middle there. So you can try it out on your crystal and just make sure it's fitting okay at the bottom there. You also need to make sure that there's no holes big enough that your crystal could fall out of. And you can always untie and retie knots if you need to before you continue on with your net. But if you're happy with the size of it and how it's looking, then we're just going to continue doing a couple more layers of knots, and then you'll start to see how many layers you need to do. So you can see for these size crystals we're going to need at least a few to come down the side here. Now we just continue on with our same technique, pulling one cord out of each side of the knots, holding that tension onto the center knot and tying a simple overhand knot in these cords, pulling them down onto that 1 centimeter mark. And doing the same for all 4 knots on this layer. So this is our 3rd layer of knots. So you can check it on your crystal in between each layer. Just see how it's going for size. So you can see here we're going to need at least 1, possibly 2 more layers of knots. So this is 4 layers of knots here. So we'll check it on our crystals again. This size would probably be okay if this was our biggest crystal. But you do want to base your nets off the biggest crystal that you're going to place in there. So for me it's this white one, and you can see that I do need a few more knots up the top here. So I'll just go ahead and do 1 more layer. Okay, so this is 5 layers of knots on our macrame net. So we'll just check it on our bigger crystal and make sure the net is fitting on it okay. This is looking much better. You want those knots coming right to the top of your crystal. Now we're going to tie an overhand knot on each side to create 2 sort of straps. So just bringing the 4 cords on one side together and tying an overhand knot, pulling it down about 1 centimeter away from those previous knots, but it does need to fit your bead there in between. So if you've got a bigger bead, just make these knots a little bit further away. Once you've got your overhand knots on each side, then we're going to slide our bead on, bringing all the threads through and pulling that bead right down over those 2 overhand knots, and that locks your little crystal in place. Now we place our little keyring or carabiner in the center as well, in between the 2 straps, and tie a knot on the end. Now don't do what I did and cut my ends off too short too soon. I had to modify it slightly, but you want to tie your knot first, and then once you're happy with it, then you can cut your ends off. So just tying all of your threads in an overhand knot, pulling that down nice and tight. So you want to leave a couple of centimeters in between the bead and this bigger knot, so that you've got enough space to pull it apart and pull your crystal out. But once you've checked it and you're definitely happy with the length, then you can cut the tails off nice and short and singe them with a lighter so they don't fray. Now you should be able to gently slide that bead up, pulling the straps apart and then swapping out your crystal. Might be a little bit fiddly getting that crystal in and out, but it's better to be a little bit tight than a little bit loose. Now bringing that bead back down again to lock that crystal in place. So there's your knotted crystal keyring.